So the topic of tonight's talk, which I think you all know, is the Dharma of conflict resolution. So approaching conflict, what is it? How to resolve it? Of course, from the approach of the Buddha's teachings or Buddha Dharma. The subtitle is The Strategy of Wisdom and Compassion, which, if we speak of Buddha Dharma, that's really the main principles behind all of it, wisdom and compassion. And I hope to talk about what is that. So I'd like to start first just defining conflict. What is conflict? I think we may each have our own idea of what is conflict, but I'll define it just so that we're on the same page. And we could look at conflict as lack of harmony. Lack of harmony or well-being. And conflict, in this context that I'll speak of tonight, can be not only one individual being in conflict with another, or an individual in conflict with a group, two groups in conflict, many groups of people in conflict. It can also refer to ourself being not in harmony with ourself. So being in opposition with ourself, another, a group, and persisting over time. I think it's safe to say that a true conflict needs some time, persistence over time to really be considered a conflict. If it's over as soon as it's happened, then it's nothing to mention. It's not really an ongoing issue. And so with opposition, whether it's with ourselves, with others, there's also a feeling there, right? With conflict, it's not only the phenomenon of being in opposition, not being in harmony. For example, just an argument, an ongoing argument can be one kind of conflict. But when there's conflict, there's also, excuse me, an uncomfortable or unpleasant feeling. And usually that's in all the parties involved. An uncomfortable, unpleasant emotional state, and it usually results in a bodily feeling that's unpleasant. So this state of opposition with an unpleasant feeling, if we're in opposition with ourselves, what is that like? How could a person be in opposition with themselves? Well, if we just reflect for a moment, a person may be unhappy with their own body. Could be just the way the body looks. I think we can probably all relate to this to some degree. We're unhappy with some aspect of how our body looks, how our body is functioning, the state of our health, or lack of health, or illnesses. We may really dislike that and are unable to accept it. We could be unhappy with our gender. We could be unhappy with also our feelings, how we feel, the emotional state that we're in. Maybe we don't like it. Maybe we're frustrated because we feel something unpleasant. Someone shared with me that a client shared that he feels this ongoing anxiety it's not very intense, but it's persistent. And the feeling is, he used the word, it's maddening. It's maddening to have this constant feeling of anxiety. That's kind of conflict with one's own feelings. Even our thoughts. Our own thoughts. Some people are at conflict or in opposition with the thoughts that come into their mind. Another person I know of who, when they have certain thoughts that surprise themselves, some of them were violent thoughts, some of them were sexual thoughts. As soon as the thought came into mind, that person said they went into a kind of panic because they just didn't even want these thoughts to happen in their own mind. That's a conflict with oneself, conflict with one's own thoughts. And from my work with people and just my own observation of myself, we can be critical of ourselves, right? So after we do something, even after it's been completed long ago, something that happened in the past, we may still be criticizing ourselves about it, right? How could I have done that? That's so stupid of me. I can't believe I did that again. We're critical of our behavior or of our speech. And some people live with a critical voice, this internal commentary, almost as if there's this person, or this, as if there's a kind of this bad commentator living inside of our own mind. Some people experience it as their own voice. Other people experience it as what feels like an external voice. People struggling with psychosis, various forms of it, may even believe that there is a being inside of them, or a being outside of them that's constantly criticizing, and they have to relate to it, or kind of appease this voice in order for them to have any sense of peace. This is all being at conflict with ourselves. Being at conflict with another person, I think we're more familiar with that. We could probably all come up with many examples for that. But we could say it's being in opposition with another person, another individual. Could be an animal, could be another kind of living being, where we disagree with their behavior or their speech. Or we may disagree with our thoughts, even though we can't read a person's mind, but we may assume that we know what someone's thinking, or we could get a sense of what someone is thinking based on their speech, and maybe we disagree with it strongly, or we just don't like it. And that may persist even when we're not present with that person, right? I think we all have an example in our daily life of a person we're in opposition with, we disagree with. Even if they're not present, we may still be thinking about them, kind of envisioning them, in a way carrying them with us. And we experience a sense of conflict even when they're not in the same room, or even if it's years past and we haven't had any connection with the person, we could still feel that we're at conflict with them. Which is really interesting if we just reflect on that. Even when we are not present with someone, we can't see them, but they live in our mind in a way, in the narrative or the story we have of them in our mind. That's another kind of conflict. And then, of course, we have group conflict, which is very complicated because group conflict is, a group is made up of a bunch of individuals. And even if a group of people align with a certain value system or certain ideology, whether it's a kind of virtuous ideology of protecting the environment, or maybe it's a hateful ideology, kind of racist group of people whose ideology is based on hatred or some kind of supremacy. Even within a group, there is differences. So it's very complicated because every person in that group has their own take on the ideology. Super complicated. But we could see conflict with groups because there are general opposing ideologies, and groups identify other groups and say, I don't like this about that group. Maybe one group doesn't like the identity of another group. They don't like the way they look. They don't like the way they behave. They don't like the culture of that group. It's just too different. It's too foreign. um, and we see this within our own country. Well, it depends on what country you're in right now. But in the United States, there's so many different kinds of cultural groups, many different kinds of ideologies. And even within one race of people, we can see opposing ideologies, the Northerners, the Southerners, people on this side of town, people on that side of town. And it's interesting how group conflict can transmit and be more powerful and destructive than just individual conflict. Right? When two people are fighting, when two people have an argument, it could be bad. It could be bad for their whole life. But okay, when they die, that conflict is over, relatively speaking. But if it's groups, the group conflict may be passed from one generation to the next. And that can be a very destructive thing, how the violence of this conflict can go on for generations or even centuries. And we know places across the whole globe where groups of people have been in conflict for centuries. There are examples. It could be based on race. It could be based on gender. Conflicts could be based even on age, the age of people, the young people versus the old people, the younger generation versus the older generation. Or it even could be based on religion. And it seems at this point, almost no religion or almost all religions have been a part of serious conflict throughout our global history. And then it seems that the peak of conflict, when this opposition or this disagreement of views or disagreement comes to a climax, we have war. War is like the physical manifestation of the most severe kind of conflict. And these are, of course, terribly painful and destructive phenomena, things. So before I say more, you can just reflect on yourself. Is there a conflict that you're going through in your life at this moment? I may give different examples just to illustrate things more clearly, but you can reflect on your own conflict. Maybe this talk can provide you some useful information and some useful methods for dealing with it. So I think we've defined conflict. It's fairly simple to understand. We've all experienced it. What is the source of conflict according to the Buddha's teachings? What is the true source of this opposition and conflict? The short answer, the mind. The Buddha's teachings look internally to the source of all conflict and all human suffering as our mind and how we use it, as well as our mind and how we understand it or how we experience it. In general, what this means is that the source of conflict doesn't come from the outside. In terms of the Buddha's teachings, if the source of conflict was the outside, well, then why not just destroy it? Why not just get rid of it? Some people's view of conflict is that there is a conflict and it comes from the environment or it comes from other people. It's not our fault or it's not my fault. Well, with this kind of view, that usually quickly leads to some sort of violent behavior to try to get rid of what's causing the conflict outside. And that's how fights and wars happen, right? Somebody says something to us, it's very terrible. And if we have a bad temper, we may quickly just go for them, attack them, swing at them, or use some more harsh words or throw something to try to get rid of what's causing us to feel uncomfortable, to feel this unpleasant feeling of conflict. The Buddha's teaching is to look inwards. It's the mind, and in particular, it's our mind's discrimination. The Chinese word for that that's used in Buddhist teachings is 分别心. 分别心. One way to translate is discrimination, but I think we also need to define what is that in this context. Well, discrimination in this Buddhist context, as a terminology, it just refers to attachment to our value judgments. That's discrimination. Attachment to a judgment. So attachment to our idea of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, even our attachment to the view of what is this and what is that. Is this color white, or is this color yellow, or is this off-white, or is this more of a beige? Even our attachment to our identification or identity is discrimination in the Buddhist context. Attachment to any ideas or notions of this, that, myself, my self-identity, your identity, right, wrong, good, and bad. And if we just reflect on maybe the last argument we've had with someone, isn't it true that a key thing that keeps the argument going is that one party wants to be right, or maybe both parties want to be right, and they don't want to be wrong? Why do we keep arguing unless I really want to be right and make sure that I let you know that you're wrong? This is how arguments just perpetuate. Who's right, who's wrong, or who's good for doing something just, or who's bad for doing something unjust, right? Just think about all of these arguments that we've had. This is really the core issue, the idea of this right and wrong, good and bad. This is discrimination. But then maybe your next thought is, okay, well, does Buddhism say that we have to get rid of all distinctions of good and bad and right and wrong? That would be chaotic. And how does it even make sense when Buddhism has its own set of values of what is good, what is bad, what is right and wrong? In Buddhism, it's called precepts. It's just basically the ethical teachings of Buddhism. For example, it's not good to kill, not good to steal, not good to lie, etc. Not good to have affairs and harmful sexual behavior. It's not good to become intoxicated because we'll probably do all these other harmful things. This is Buddhism's basic set of ethics, and it is a kind of distinction: good, bad, right, and wrong. Buddhism says that it's important to make these distinctions so that we have some semblance of order as a society, and so that we can guide our behavior to do things that are more helpful and avoid things that are harmful. But within the Buddhist teachings, it also says that if we attach to precepts or become fixated on rules and guidelines, that's also a problem. That can also create a lot of problems and conflict. I'm going to tell a story in a little bit, which illustrates this, but I want to save the story for a little bit later. So discrimination is attachment to views of good and bad, right and wrong. It doesn't mean that we should get rid of them. Values, morals, they have their place. So the problem is attachment to views, and that leads to a rigid way of thinking. So one example in American society, and I think it's also a global issue, the issue of abortion law. When I say that word, abortion and laws, I wonder, does something arise within you, a view or an idea of what should be done, right? I'm sure most people have their view on it. What should we do with it? Should people be allowed to do abortion, or should it be completely banned? Or is there a middle ground where it can be appropriate in some instances and maybe not appropriate in others? Many of us have our own views on it. Maybe some of us don't. Some of us are just like, I have a headache and I don't have time to think about these things. That's also another kind of view. What's the answer? I don't know. Do I dare to say Buddhism has a definitive answer? I'm not going to make that the topic of today's talk, but to use this as an example. What happens when people try to come together and solve these societal issues? Of course, we see lots of argument and lots of conflict and even violence because of the difference of views. Of course, the views are not only just thinking, people have experience with it as well. The women who have a baby, who don't know what to do, who have had an abortion, they have their own experiences. So their views are based on their experience. And then we have women who have never had a child, never had an abortion. They also have different experience, so they have different views. And then you have men, which have no chance of having a child or abortion, and they have their own views as well. So it's based on kinds of experiences. But when we attach to views, when we attach to our experience and our view as the only way, but this is right and you are wrong, we have conflict. We have enormous conflict with issues like this in society. Even when people don't want to have conflict, when people don't want to fight, if there's attachment to their view, very likely, unless everyone agrees with them, they'll experience conflict, or we will experience conflict. So rigid views, this rigid way of thinking, it also leads to emotional turmoil, right? Having an argument is not pleasant. Being in a huge conflict, societal conflict, is not pleasant. And we have all kinds of tumultuous emotions. Anger. There's so much incredible anger with conflicts when there's rigid views. So much anger. Even if it seems to be the most virtuous thing that almost maybe seems like we shouldn't argue about it. Like, protecting the natural environment or protecting our global environment. I think everyone would agree on that. But how to do that? Everyone has different views. What's the best way to save our global environment? Some people say, well, the best way is we have to not use fossil fuels. And there's all science behind that. And they have their own theories. Another group says, no, we should use all the fuels we can and we should just plant more trees. That's the way. And they have their own science and their own views. When there's argument, though, there's emotion and there's often hatred. We can hate other people because they don't agree with us, which is quite sad. And then this powerful emotion, again, leads to all kinds of harmful behavior. Even if we don't lash out and physically harm other people, our own emotions are damaging ourselves, right? What happens to our body if we live with anger? If we live, with this kind of fire of anger, what happens to our physical condition? We can harm ourselves, exhaust ourselves, and develop different kinds of illness. On a deeper level, Buddhism looks at the source of conflict, the most fundamental source of conflict, as attachment to our idea of self. And what happens with an idea of self? There's also an idea of other. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have this sense, or this strong identity, that it seems that this person, this little body and mind, is somehow completely separate from others and somehow permanent. Whether it's our body, whether we see our body as this separate individual, separate and permanent, even though we know we're going to die, even though we know, we need to eat in order to survive, we often forget how dependent we are on the whole environment, everything around us, for our existence. And we feel separate, we feel isolated, and it feels like the world is outside of us. This is the source of conflict. And why? Because as soon as we have that attachment, as soon as we have this self-attachment, or clinging to this idea of a separate self, we take ourself to be the most important thing, the most cherished thing, and everything else as lesser. To the extreme sometimes, where we feel that doing harm to everything around us won't harm us. Some people, for the sake of their aspiration or reaching their goals, they may harm all the people around them, even destroy their own environment, burn everything down for the sake of their own achievements, without even realizing that they're harming themselves. Because of this self-view, that the self is the most important thing, everything else is secondary. An analogy that can be used to describe this is kind of like a dog barking at its reflection. You ever see that? And if you have pets, the dogs barking at their reflection, or even birds, pet birds, seeing their reflection and, kind of either being curious, falling in love with their reflection. Actually, my aunt used to let us take care of her bird, and the bird loved itself. And it used to like kiss and rub up against the mirror. It was its, own reflection. Other times I've seen birds at the side view mirror of a car, pecking at it, fighting it, because it thought it was another bird. Now, this analogy, or this analogy of self-attachment, is where we have an image of what our self is in our mind, and we cling to it, and we see everything as being separate. And that's we could say, the core or source of conflict, because we forget to take care of others, and we forget the self's dependence on others, and we cling to the self desperately and are afraid of losing it. And then we cling to everything else around us. The things we like, we try to possess. The things we don't like, we try to get rid of, try to get away from the self, from ourselves. So all the craving or aversion is based on the self-attachment, the attachment to self. And of course, this leads to the struggle for resources. Why do countries have war over resources? I mean, can't we share? And it's easy to say, but if we were a country that didn't have resources and our neighbor has them, our neighbor selfishly possesses all the resources, tries to keep all the resources for themselves. The first country will probably not be happy with that. The second country will probably be afraid of being attacked. And eventually, wars come out of that. Selfishness, the inability to at least try to share and try to make sure that everyone is well cared for. Not that it's easy, but this is the source of conflict: self, other, and fighting for resources, craving and aversion for what we like, what we don't like. I like to share a story that actually comes from the Buddhist tradition. It's actually a story of conflict that happened within the monastic community. Of course, the monastic community, if you're not familiar, it's made up of people who have left behind the everyday, ordinary life of a layperson who has a family and who has a job. And monastics leave behind the pursuit of wealth and family for the pursuit of spiritual awakening, or the pursuit of inner contentment. We live a simple life, a life of poverty for the most part, just living with the essentials and in community. So everyone does this, of course, of their own free will. So everyone chooses to join a community like this. And this community of spiritual practice, or this community of introspection and trying to realize peace and harmony, of course, has its own conflicts. So we shouldn't be ignorant and think that, oh, just because someone becomes a monastic and shaves their head and wears robes, that they're just free from conflict. I was a monk before. I lived within a community, and yeah, we had conflicts, but we had ways to resolve them. So we want to have a realistic view of the monastic community. There, it's a very virtuous way to live, but we should have a realistic view. And the Buddha, I'll summarize the story. The story goes that when the monastic community, it's called the Sangha in the Buddhist tradition, when the monastic Sangha was convened and living together, there was one situation that occurred where one of the monks forgot to clean out the washing basin, basically like, the bathtub. The monk forgot to clean out the bathtub, and another monk saw that. So the monk number one was what's called a sutra master, who was very well versed in the teachings. The monk number two was a precept master, who was very well versed in the discipline of monastic life. When the precept master saw that the wash basin was still dirty, he got very mad, and he pointed out the sutra master's transgression. He said, "You didn't clean out the wash basin when you were finished. You left all that funk in there. Now somebody else has to clean it. That's a transgression, and you should repent. And until you show up at the recitation, at the monthly reciting, and until you repent in front of everyone, you've transgressed, and you can't come. You can't join the meetings." It's pretty intense. It was just a bathtub that was a little dirty, but it eventually developed into this argument where the precept master was very critical and judging of the sutra master. The sutra master, what was his perspective? Well, it's interesting that because he was versed in the teachings, he focused on a more philosophical perspective of he didn't do it intentionally. He forgot to clean the basin, but he didn't do it on purpose. So he shouldn't be at fault. And they got into an argument. And they argued to the point where there was almost a split within the community. The students of the precept master all joined the precept master in criticizing the sutra teacher. The sutra teacher's disciples, who are probably more philosophical, all joined his side and said, it's true, he wasn't intentional. So based on that, and they had this argument, this persistent argument that lasted days. Some other disciples went to see the Buddha and said, Master, you have to come and you have to see this. Everyone's fighting. The community is about to split. Can you say something to help resolve this? So the Buddha went there. He went from his hut to eventually where the monks were residing. And he said to them, please don't fight. Can't we resolve this peacefully? Can't we resolve this conflict? It's the principle of the Sangha to be in harmony. We shouldn't live in disharmony. It's harmful for ourselves, and it's harmful for the lay practitioners who learn from us. What did the other monks say? Well, one monk stood up and said, we don't need you. We're adults. We can take care of this ourselves. And when that monk stood up and said that to the Buddha, who's, is like the master, everyone was quiet and probably in shock. What did the Buddha do? He just quietly adjusted his robes and took his leave. He left, and he went on a journey to walk in the woods and walk to another sangha to see how they were doing. Apparently, the Buddha saw that they weren't even open to his advice or his suggestion. So he left. He left them to deal with it themselves. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, he left them to deal with it themselves. So even within the monastic sangha during the Buddha's time, they were so much engrossed in that conflict. The two parties were so rigidly fixed on their views that they wouldn't even listen to their own teacher, the founder of the very way of living that they were practicing. And I've seen that within my own community. When I was a monk, we had some conflicts, and our teacher, Master Shengyan, would sometimes hold a meeting and try to encourage everyone. But still, there would be fights and conflicts where the rigid views and attachment to ideas of what's right and wrong would be so strong that no one would even listen to the teacher, listen to who we saw as a master, a true leader. So that's just an example of conflict and showing how it's a human thing, and it even happens within the ideal, or what we often see as the ideal community of the Buddhist monastics. There's another story I'd like to share that follows that, but I'll share it a bit later. It's the community who lived in harmony that the Buddha went to visit. I'll first just share, though, that it is a principle within Buddhism that, yes, conflict is unavoidable, but it's possible to cultivate. It's possible to cultivate harmonious relationships with others and ourselves through inward introspection, and also through skillful communication. But what is the idea of harmony in Buddhism? What is the idea or the ideal? We could say a more practical ideal, or the more practical idea of harmony, is where we allow ourselves and others to have our own way of being, our own way of living. Which means, of course, we have some standard of what is wholesome and unwholesome. We can't just say, oh, let's just be in harmony. Let's not fight. So just let those people go and kill whoever they want. If we just let people kill whoever they want, that's allowing a lot of harm and destruction. So we have certain standards where we try to keep people from doing harm, preventing harm. However, we can also still respect other people's values and the fact that others' values are different than ours. Being in harmony doesn't mean we give up our own values and just say, okay, whatever you say, I'll just go along with you. We can still have differences of values, differences of ideas, but we are more allowing of others and respectful of others' ways of being. So, for example, if you identify as a Buddhist and you value not only not killing people, but maybe you value not killing animals. Maybe you're a vegetarian or vegan, or you don't eat animal meat. What about people who eat meat? Should we force them to not eat meat? Or should we try to convince them to not eat meat? Can we allow other people to eat the meat of animals? This is actually maybe a big question for some of us. If we don't allow other people to eat meat, or we feel we have to convince other people that eating meat is bad and that they should feel bad for that, or that there's bad karmic retribution for that. It's another Buddhist terminology for saying, there's a consequence for that. We'll have conflict. If we're rigid in our view that no one should eat meat, everyone should refrain from it, then we'll find ourselves in conflict. Whereas, can we be Buddhist practitioners or plant-based diet people, however you identify? Can you allow other people to have their own way and realize that they have their own values? We could still encourage other people to refrain from killing animals or refrain from eating their meat, eating a plant-based diet for the sake of compassion for those living beings. We could still encourage others or educate others or just share. And we could share in a way which is harmonious, in which we feel at ease. Our experience is that we're at ease when we share of our own practices, and in a way that's less threatening to other people. That's an example of how Buddhism looks at harmony, where there's differences, different people, different needs, even different conditions, different values. And we have our own, but we respect others' values. And we can still communicate. We can communicate the benefits of a certain value or the potential harms of another value. We can still have discussion, and we could even still have debate. This is kind of interesting. Even within the Buddhist tradition, there's a practice of debate. Have any of you attended any of these? It's actually quite common in the Tibetan tradition, debating as a practice, right? It's really not as common within the Chinese Zen, Chinese Chan, or Zen. Although Zen does have what's called Dharma combat, right? And of course, in the Indian tradition of Buddhism, which is more historical, there were well-known debaters, and there would be debate contests that like hundreds of people would attend and watch. The practice of debate doesn't necessarily mean that there's a rigid fixation to views and emotional turmoil and hatred. If there is, that's not a debate. That's just an argument. That's conflict. But if the persons who are debating recognize that their views may actually be flawed, or their views are not perfect, that they could learn from someone else's views, or that this is just an exchange of views, and not for the purpose of winning, not for the purpose of saying this view, this is the best one, but for the purpose of learning, and for the purpose of awakening, for the purpose of insight, debates were held. That's the original purpose. I'm sure later on debates became like, different factions, different schools of Buddhism wanted to win and be seen as more superior than others. That's the human condition. That's competition. But the original purpose of debate is to learn and to discover the weakness of our views, the problems with our views, so that we can alter them, improve upon them, and that our views just become guidelines for practice, guidelines for developing wisdom and compassion, not things to cling to like some blind faith. So even debate, the practice of debate, the practice of discussion can be harmonious, but it's not easy. It really requires a lot of self-awareness. So if we go back to our abortion law issue in the United States, I wonder what it would look like if people had the principle of respecting each other's values and even considering that one's own views may not be the whole picture, that we may be lacking information, lacking some maturity in our view. What if in our process of lawmaking or in our process of kind of societal discussion, what if we emphasized respecting each other's values, respecting each other? And what if we emphasized self-awareness, speaking and even debating, discussing in ways that promote more peaceful communication? I bet it would look a lot different. But again, it's not easy. This idea of harmony within Buddhism, this is one level. Respecting others, while still having our own views and using them, still having values, respecting others, learning from others. On a deeper level, the idea of harmony within the Buddha's teachings is selflessness, the wisdom of selflessness. Or before I just said conflict, the source of conflict is self-attachment, seeing ourselves as separate from others, in opposition. Harmony is the dissolving of that sense of separateness. Harmony within Buddhism is selflessness, or the dissolving of that sense of rigid separation between ourselves and the world, ourself and the world. So that, of course, we still have a body, we still have our thoughts and feelings, but we see it as an integrated whole with the world. And what happens when we see our body as this dynamic, changing, integrated thing? Well, actually, we don't see it as a thing anymore. True harmony, there's no sense of subject or object. It's beyond concepts. It's even beyond the concept of selflessness. True wisdom or true insight is just an experience of harmony. There's no more craving or aversion, but we still take care of what needs to be done. We still eat, we still sleep, we still help other people eat, help other people sleep well, take care of our families and societies. But the conflict is dissolved when self-attachment is dissolved. When self-attachment is dissolved, there's a more a view of, it's described as a view of equality. Everything is equally important. What that means is that we still value all beings and all people as part of this integrated whole, and we value their well-being. So that's where compassion comes from. The experience of wisdom, compassion comes along with that. We're not only obsessively concerned with this self as with conflict, with self-attachment, there's an obsession with the well-being of the self. That's not there with wisdom. That's not there with true harmony. There's care for this being, but there's also a sense that every other being is equally important. Just like if Master Thich Nhat Hanh used to say, if the left hand gets cut, the right hand just comes to help put on a bandage. It's that kind of simple relationship, simple response. That's the Buddhist idea or ideal of harmony, of enlightenment. Is it easy to realize or experience? No, again, it's not easy, but it can be cultivated. Before I talk about how to cultivate it, I'd like to now recount the second story, the example of the harmonious Sangha during the Buddha's time. So the Buddha left that first community. He just left for a trip and to let them deal with it themselves. The monks arguing over the dirty bathtub. The Buddha went to visit a smaller community. It was just a handful of monastics. But he went to visit and he's like, how are you doing here? Are you all living in harmony? And they said, yes, we're living in harmony and gratitude. This is a wonderful situation. And one monk said, I feel very appreciative of my brother monks. They're my friends on the path. And he said, well, how is that? Tell me how you live together. And he said, well, we go begging together in the morning. When we come back after begging, one of us will just go and set up the table, set up the places to sit. One of our brother monks, who's usually the first one, will put the bowl in the middle and he'll put his food that he received from the donors. He'll put his food into the group bowl first, and then we'll all add our food in afterwards. We share our food. We wash the bowls together when we're done. We take the food scraps and we either give them to the animals or bury them. And when it's time to do different tasks, like cleaning the toilet, well, when it needs to be done, one of us will just do it. When it's time to fetch water, one of us will just go and do it. And we just take responsibility as we see needed. And we support each other when we just live in this harmonious way. We practice, we do our meditations, and we share about our experiences. And it's wonderful. The Buddha was very happy to hear that. And he said, this is truly a Sangha living in harmony. If you compare the other Sangha arguing over a dirty bathtub, this community, whoever needs to clean, whenever the toilet is dirty. And remember, this is not a porcelain toilet. If we think of toilets, we probably have this porcelain toilet come up in our mind. The toilet was probably either a hole in the ground or even something that needed to be cleaned, and the feces would need to be removed and even scraped off of the toilet in order to really clean it. So cleaning the toilet back then was a dirty task. You don't just swash the whatever you call that, the scrubber, and then it all disappears. You may have to scrape off around the toilet and carry it out and bury it somewhere else. But they did it with no argument, no complaint. Just as a side note, there's a story about 3 monks living together. It's kind of a Chinese story, and just the name of it is called 三个和尚没水喝. It just means when there are 3 monks, there's no water. There's no water to drink. And what did that mean? Well, it just meant that when one monk was living there, of course, there was only himself to rely on, or monk or nun, and she would have to go get the water herself. If it was 2 nuns living together, well, then they could help. They could carry water together. It's easier to carry a heavy thing with maybe a pole, carry a heavy bucket of water with 2 people. So the 2 nuns would, or the 2 monks, whatever, would still have water to drink. If it was 3 of them, there would be no water to drink. Why? Because they'd probably argue, well, if there's 3 of us, well, how about you 2 go get it? I went yesterday. I'm tired. Or the other one says, I went 3 days in a row. You go. They'd start to argue. It's kind of a joke, but it also explains how in certain communities, it can be easy to push the blame on someone and take sides. So if there's 3 or more, or if there's a community, there's complication, there's conflict, and there's argument. Of course, that's not the intention of a Buddhist community. So again, the Buddha praised the community that was living in harmony and said, you're truly practicing the way. You're truly practicing the path of insight. One of the monks who was recounting how he felt, he said, we're 3 people, but it feels like there's 1 of us. And maybe this is something you can relate to. Have you ever lived with someone else or a group together and just felt it was so harmonious? It felt like it was one organism. It was just like one of you. Everybody kind of knew what needed to be done. And maybe sometimes you even know what the other person's thinking, or you get a sense of what they're thinking. It's like, yeah, how did you know I was thinking that? That kind of harmony, there's often a sense of just being one, or being one unit, one totality. It may not be, strictly speaking, enlightenment or wisdom, but it's close, and it's going in that direction. When we don't feel so much of a sense of, oh, why do I have to do the dishes again? You do the dishes. It's not so much as of a sense of myself being in opposition to you. It's just like the right hand going to support or protect the left hand. It's just so natural. This is a very kind of visual and a good illustration for wisdom, for this true experience of harmony and selflessness. We all operate as a unit, just doing what needs to be done. No complaints about who did less or who did more. That's harmony, when all that is gone. Conflict is gone. After the Buddha heard the monk recounting how they lived together in harmony, he then summarized, what is it, or how is it that we can be in harmony? The Buddha summarized it in a concrete way, which I'm going to share with everyone. This is the how to be in harmony according to the Buddha's teachings. What I said before is more just either philosophical or conceptual. What is conflict? What is harmony? Well, now, how can we be in harmony? The Buddha shared what's called the 6 principles for living in harmony. The Chinese is 六合敬, 六个和谐的，尊敬的，能够又和谐又尊敬的，生存，或是一起共住. So it just means the 6 principles for living together in harmony. Strictly speaking, if we were truly wise, if we were truly compassionate and wise, we wouldn't need any prescription like this or any set of guidelines, right? And what's interesting is in the earlier times of the Buddha's sharing his teaching, he didn't even have any rules for the monastics. It was only later that rules were created as he saw problems occurring. Because we are not enlightened. We are still quite very selfish, very self-absorbed, and prone to conflict. So for the awakened ones, they don't need a set of guidelines, but these can be used to develop wisdom. These guidelines can be used so that we eventually don't need them. They help us develop and experience harmony so that we live it and we can just share this way of harmonious living naturally. But it's important to have guidelines in the beginning. It's important to have structure. And I'm emphasizing this because there are some Buddhists who say, especially Zen Buddhists, Chan practitioners who say, oh, you don't need rules, just meditate. Right? You don't need rules, just wake up. Or I am already enlightened, so I don't need this stuff. Usually the people who say that have the biggest problems and the biggest conflicts and who are oftentimes the most self-absorbed, rigidly believing in their enlightenment and superiority and thinking that all these rules are nonsense. It's wiser to know that rules are necessary and can help us realize wisdom. So the Buddha kind of spelled it out in six guidelines for harmony. I'll just say them first and then talk about them in brief. And I'll also try to save some time for a kind of Q&A and discussion. Just to check in with Warren, we finish at 9:30, right?
That's correct, David.
Okay, got it. So the 6 principles are the first one is with regard to resources. The Chinese is 利和同均. English just means to share the essentials of daily life together. Just to share our basic needs. 利和同均. Chinese is very abbreviated and poetic. The English is very long and wordy. It's just the way it goes. So in the Buddhist Sangha, that meant all the food was shared. You know, when you go begging for alms, you come back, you actually share the food. That's one way to do it. Food, medicine, even robes were shared. The second is with regard to law. Law or discipline. It's called 戒和同修, which just means observing the precepts together, observing an ethical lifestyle together. So, you know, the basic Buddhist ethics for monastics were, of course, this very similar to those of lay people. No killing, stealing, lying, intoxicants. But actually for monastics, the emphasis was on not lying and no sexual behavior at all. If you didn't know, Buddhist monastics who observe what's called the Vinaya, they're celibate. So there's no sexual behavior at all, even with themselves. So that was placed first. No sexual behavior and no lying, which emphasized not claiming that you have some spiritual attainment to try and influence people. And then hundreds of other precepts that are minor, related to how to deal with robes, how to deal with food, all that. But the basic principle is we follow these guidelines together. Again, I'm just going to share these, how it worked in the Buddhist monastic context. Then we can explore how, briefly, how could it work in a layperson's context? The third, well, because of time, let me just say it this way. Directly share what it looks like in lay life. So the first one, sharing essentials of daily life. Well, can't we also share food and medicine with each other, the people that we live with? Food, medicine, even share clothing, whether it's, sharing hand-me-downs to the next generation or just sharing clothing, sharing basic essentials, maybe sharing transportation. Part of that can create a lot of harmony, sharing our resources. What about lay people living together? Are there laws or precepts? Well, it's probably rare to have a bunch of Buddhists all living together. If you have that, well, you're quite fortunate. Even if you don't, what about house rules, right? We live with people, there are house rules. In some places there are, in some places there are not. In places without house rules, it can be chaotic. In places with house rules, at least people have a basic idea of how to live together, sharing certain responsibilities. Who does the dishes? Who cleans the toilet? If this happens, who can help take care of it? This can also foster harmony, but it needs to be communicated. Maybe that's one thing that with just living together with people, we're afraid to do. We're afraid to sit down in a group and actually discuss rules, guidelines. Why? Because it may lead to conflict. But if we do work on it, it can develop harmony. It can be hard, but coming up with common guidelines for how to live together and spelling it out, it can foster more harmony than conflict. The third principle has to do with our body and the environment. The Chinese is 身和同住, which just means that we share a common space. In the Buddha's time, they shared a forest space, or they shared a monastery or an area with different huts, forest dwelling. For lay folks, yeah, we share a home, we share apartments, we share houses. And we could emphasize the harmony or the cleanliness of that space, the order of that space. And this is very close with the previous one, how to live in that space. What are the house rules? But sharing a space and caring for that space so it's neat and tidy, convenient for everyone to use. And in this way, a healthier space that fosters harmony. This may seem like common sense, but there are also some even Buddhist practitioners who feel like, well, why clean up? Just be natural. It also seems like the Zen and Chan people. Yeah, who needs rules? Who needs orderly? Just be natural. If there's mess, no problem. But if we actually look at Zen and Chan monasteries, they're very tidy for the most part. But some people may think that, oh, I don't need this stuff. I'll just cultivate my mind. Who needs a tidy space? I'll just cultivate my mind. Well, honestly, if the space is a mess, our mind is probably a mess. It got messy because of the mess of our mind. And when we can't find things and we're tripping over things and we just look at our space and we don't know what to look at, it fosters a chaotic mind, scattered mind. So the way we live in a space together, and that space's cleanliness and orderliness, actually fosters harmony. The fourth principle is with regards to speech. It's called 口和无争. And that means to use only words that contribute to harmony, avoiding all words that cause the community to break up, just avoiding argument. On the surface, this may seem like, okay, so should we never argue as Buddhists, or should we never argue if we want to practice this way of harmony? It doesn't mean we're never going to argue. It just means that we are careful when we speak. We're careful that when there is an argument or when there's a discussion, something needs to be discussed about how to maintain harmony in our community, that we're careful not to use words that are harmful, that hurt, or careful not to use words that come from aggression or anger, or trying to make the other person feel stupid, feel wrong. This can be hard to do, but actually practicing speech that fosters harmony can actually help us reflect on our own mind and our own way of thinking. Even if we really believe we're the one who's right and the other person is wrong, even by practicing more harmonious speech, it can help us change our stance and change our own view, so that we're less rigid. If we speak in a way that's something like, for example, I understand that you think, leaving the dishes in the sink for a few days is not a problem. I understand that. It's not a problem for you. But for me, it's a problem. Instead of all of a sudden just saying, you pig, how could you just leave dishes in the sink for 5 days? It stinks. What are you, a pig? There's two very different ways of communicating the same idea. But the second way can help us, or the first way, respecting the other person, validating them, can actually help us soften our own view. So practicing speech that is harmonious is the fourth. The fifth refers to thought. It's called 义和同悦, which means just respecting others' viewpoints and not forcing someone to follow our viewpoint. This is very challenging, again, but we can practice just by practicing respecting and acknowledging that somebody else sees something differently. That's just the reality. Somebody sees something differently. The other person has, or the other group has a totally different experience. And that's completely natural and normal. Everyone's conditions are different. Everyone's experiences are different. Of course, it's natural to have different thoughts and views. To recognize that and to respect their viewpoint, again, can help soften us so that we're not trying to force people to even think differently. Not only forcing them to behave differently, but that we're not trying to force someone to think differently. And that even within a Buddhist community, people practicing the same way of living, there are, again, certain core views that guide the practice. But then there are also differences. Maybe for one person, sitting meditation is the best practice for them. Maybe sitting meditation is the thing that can help them heal the most. But maybe for somebody else, it's not. Maybe the practice for somebody else is walking mindfully. Maybe a practice for somebody else is charity, giving in a certain way. Helping others, helping the ill could be the best practice for somebody else. Which is important for Buddhists of all traditions to remember, that even though we may think our own method, our own system of approach to practicing the Buddha's way is the best, it may be the best for you, or it may be the best for ourselves, but it's maybe not the best for somebody else. Maybe another religion is better for somebody else. Maybe no religion is better for another person. So this is the teaching on harmony of thought. The last of the principles is with regards to wisdom, and it's called 见和同解. 见和同解, which means sharing insights and understandings together. This refers to, because of our practice of developing harmony, through wisdom and compassion, reflecting on ourselves, reflecting on our self-attachment, our rigid attachment to views, we start to learn how to soften and release this rigid attachment. We can learn how to use our ideas skillfully. We could learn how to live more skillfully, at peace, at ease. When we share that with others, that can be a wonderful, nourishing thing. Even if we have slightly different insights and different experiences, that's fine. We can share with others and help us all continue to develop these practices of harmony, mutually encouraging each other. So whether it's Buddhists sharing with each other the experiences on the path, or as a Buddhist practitioner, or as someone of another faith, whoever you are, just your way of being, your way of engaging with other people more harmoniously. That's a way of sharing. Your way of being is sharing harmony with others. You're living harmoniously so that people can see it. And it's just natural. It's natural that others see it. And if you're living in this way, you know, or if we are living in this way, we can also learn from others, learn from their wisdom. These are the 6 principles of harmony that the Buddha taught. So this is how the Buddhist community practices based on these principles. I think it's also great principles for a household, for lay people, for Buddhists and non-Buddhists. These are great 6 principles. Could it work in our larger society, in our societal institutions? Good question. You know, can these 6 principles be applied to even a secular community? I would say so. I don't know what you think. I think they can also be applied in a secular way. Principles of respect, shared values. It can be tricky though. But these principles, if used in our societal institutions, maybe we would have more peaceful, even debate, discussion, while we try to figure out how to bring order to our society. It's not easy, but I think we can use these principles to develop that. So to conclude, today I just shared basic concepts of conflict. What is conflict? What is harmony? What is the way to practice harmony from a Buddhist perspective? What I didn't share is more of what we practice in a way of mindfulness, whether it's mindful sitting, mindful walking, doing sitting meditation, formal practices of meditation, or, you know, by alone or on retreat. The practice of living mindfully, being fully aware of our body and our mind moment to moment, is also essential if we want to really experience harmony. If it's all conceptual, you know, if we're all just trying to think about this or just using it as tools, but without practicing a mindful way of living, it's very hard, because harmony is based on self-awareness. We need self-awareness to be able to even discover, are we at conflict? Am I at conflict with myself? Am I at conflict with someone else? That takes self-awareness and a practice of a mindful way of being. So if you're interested in that, you're interested in more of the practices of mindfulness, you can join a retreat. I'll be leading retreats, and maybe Warren or will say something about future activities with Dharma Drum. But you're encouraged to, you're welcome to attend activities where we practice both living in harmony as well as a mindful way of living. So I'd like to finish here and save a few minutes for maybe any questions that you folks have, or sharing or discussion. Feel free.